Many times we ask ourselves the question, how do I paint fill in the blank with your favorite subject in watercolor? How can I paint trees in watercolor? How can I paint clouds? How can I paint fur or feathers or hair or whatever? And you go out and search online and you do find information about how to paint fill in the blank subject. But unfortunately, I think what happens is you learn some interesting techniques and then they're kind of tied in your mind to that particular subject matter. So let's flip that around, and instead of starting with what we want to paint, let's start by making a whole bunch of different examples of watercolor effects, and then ask ourselves, what could I use this for? People have written whole books on watercolor effects, but what I'm going to do is give you 4 basic strategies, let you go off and explore them, and then challenge you to see what you can make with what you discover. So we're going to look at brush marks, and then we'll look at applying paint with things besides brushes. Then we'll try laying things in a wet wash and letting them dry in the wash. And finally, using water and gravity to move the paint. So let's start by looking at using our brushes more creatively. And what a lot of people spend a lot of their time doing is using their brush kind of like a crayon to fill in areas. So maybe you have a drawing here, and then you use your brush to fill in the shape that you're going to paint. And that's fine, but that's only one of many things your brush can do for you. And if you're doing mostly this, then what you're doing essentially is coloring in drawings. And there's so much more that watercolor can do for you. So let's explore that a little bit. So yes, I can, make marks like this that are essentially just sort of stamping with the brush. And sometimes you get some interesting things happening, like this mark where it's starting to get dry back near the ferrule. And this brush has a kind of an exaggerated point, so it makes kind of an interesting shape. So I can definitely look at this and go, well, hey, I could use that to make, flower petals by kind of stamping instead of by drawing the flower and filling in the shapes. Brush. So I can use this brush with just the tip, of course, and I kind of like to hold it way back at the end and let my hand just sort of wiggle and then maybe shoot out. So that's one kind of shape I can make with this brush. I can also lay the brush on its side and kind of roll it along. And that makes an interesting sort of mark. I could take the brush and put it down on the paper and twirl it and make an interesting shape. I could take the brush and kind of splay out the bristles and sweep it across the page. So I can explore all the different kinds of marks I can make with this brush, and then I can try my other brushes. Let's try twirling this one. That's kind of cool. Almost looks like a little snail. And that's what we're going to do with this. Now that we've made some shapes, what I suggest you do is look at them like this one and say, gosh, that looks like a little snail. So you could, go online and find tutorials where people show you what they've already discovered, making marks with their brushes. But you can also do this kind of exploration yourself and ask yourself, not how do I paint a snail in watercolor? Don't go that direction, because would you have come up with this? I wouldn't have. I would never have thought to do that. But once it happens by accident, you can look at these marks and say, what does that mark remind me of? Okay, so you can play with what kinds of marks you can make with your brushes, but you can also use other items to apply paint. So the classic one is a sponge, sort of dabbing or stamping the paint on with a sponge. And keep in mind that you can also use these other tools in different ways. So here I'm making kind of a sweeping mark with my sponge. One of my favorites is plastic film. So this is banding film. You can use saran wrap, a plastic grocery bag, piece of plastic packaging. Each kind of film makes a slightly different kind of mark. So you can wad it up and use it kind of like a sponge, except it makes a somewhat different shape mark than a sponge. You can also unfold it and use it flat, and since the paint beads up on it, you still get little dots, but you can kind of see where you're putting them. I like this aspect of this little tool. And the more paint you have on there, the bigger the marks will be that it makes, so it's worth playing around with different amounts of water and different types of plastic. And of course, you can use this tool for things other than stamping, like making little sweeping marks or maybe dragging it across the page. So don't restrict yourself to just exactly what you see me doing. It's worth also trying things that are a little crisper or crinkly, like wax paper or parchment paper or aluminum foil, because you can sort of shape them into the kinds of creases that you want to make. So here I'm going to kind of roll this into kind of a cone and then flatten it back out. So I've got this sort of a radial pattern, and I'll try stamping with that. And this might be a little difficult to press down onto my palette, so I can also just use my brush to apply paint to these materials that I'm going to make marks with. Okay. You can also use any object that has a surface that's flat enough to press down on watercolor paper. So look around your house, see what you've got, try using different creative tools to apply the paint and see what kinds of interesting marks and shapes you can make. Before we move on to strategy 3, I just want to point out that it's worth trying all these different tools, your brushes, and all these other tools on wet paper too. Okay, the third general strategy I'm going to show you is to lay a wash, and then while it's still wet, we're going to lay items in it and allow them to dry before removing them. The classic one here is saran wrap, and I absolutely love this technique. And you lay the saran wrap down, and it makes these little shapes. And if you leave it there until it's completely dry, don't peek, it will hold those little shapes. I go away and leave it overnight, because it's very tempting to go, is it dry yet? And if you pull it up and try to put it back down, you've lost it. But if you leave it overnight, you get stuff like this. So this is that this little guy made that. This is a rug mat, that rubber rug mat, anti-slip mat. There's a feather here that I put in the wash and let it dry. This is a dryer sheet. This is saran wrap, packing foam. There's bubble wrap, more saran wrap, eyelash yarn right here, and more packing foam. So method number 3, put a wash down, lay stuff in the wash, and leave it alone until it's completely dry. So if I try to pull this off now, you get some of it, but you kind of wreck it. Okay, strategy 4 is everything that involves letting water and or gravity move the paint. So this includes spattering, dripping the paint onto the page or pouring, tipping the page and letting the paint run around or drip off, dropping paint into wet paper or into a wet wash, and everything to do with intentional blooms. So as with everything else, this is a good place to try using different tools than you normally use. So use a wetter brush, a drier brush, a floppier brush. These down at the bottom were done with a toothbrush, kind of flicking off the toothbrush, and a stiff stenciling brush, so I get smaller dots and a different texture. And you can drag a loaded brush through these little spattered dots of paint and water. This is how I came across one of my favorite ways to suggest evergreen trees. Here's an example where I was playing around with spattering and spritzing with my spray bottle, and some of the paper was just totally wet. And this is the kind of thing that you look at it and you think, well, I could turn this into a window box full of flowers just by kind of suggesting the little window box itself behind this lovely, soft looking flower-like shape. If I started the other way around and asked myself, how do I paint a window box full of flowers? I'm not sure I would come up with this. So this is what I mean by working both sides of the question, trying things, and then asking yourself, what could I use this for? Or putting in a file and coming back to it when you want an interesting technique and you're not sure what to use. So my art invitation or creative challenge for you is to start your own file of interesting watercolor techniques, start exploring different ways of making marks and suggesting textures, and then take one of the things, or more than one if you want to, that you explore and turn it into a very simple little painting. Maybe just a tree or a flower or a critter of some sort or a wall. Not complicated, just one subject, postcard size. See what you can do with these techniques that you explore. Then hop over to the chat and show us what you did. Share what you discovered, either your little painting or an interesting texture technique that you hadn't seen before. Be sure to label everything and make notes on the things you put in your files so you'll know what you were doing if you go back to use that texture again. And if you want an example of what I mean by a very simple little painting, hop over to the chat. I'm going to post an example or two of my own, and I invite you to share your little paintings or just an interesting technique or effect that you want to share with everyone else. As a group, we should discover an awful lot this way that we can all take and use in our paintings.